So, good morning, good afternoon, and I guess good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining me in this presentation. Today, I'm going to talk about pragmatic approaches to studying holistic therapies. Pragmatic in the sense that I want to talk about methods, research designs that we can actually use in a clinical setting without big budgets, big resources or personnel, and pragmatic in the sense that it is practical to apply to a clinical setting. So for today, I'll give a brief introduction to what that means with pragmatic and what I mean by whole systems or holistic practices, and go through three major or main designs: the case study, single subject study, and the N-of-1 randomized trial design. And I will also talk about two concepts that is applicable to what we consider complementary, alternative, integrative, traditional medicine or health practices. And these are the concepts of whole systems research and patient-oriented research. And I will end it with a pilot study that I conducted with a colleague on the use of acupuncture in children with anxiety to give an illustration of pragmatic approaches to doing research. So what do I mean, or what do we mean when we say pragmatic approach? We mean that it is to test interventions within the spectrum of everyday clinical settings. And the idea is to maximize applicability and generalizability of our outcomes, of our findings. So the idea is that the research question is to determine whether an intervention is actually works in real life. So pragmatic means measuring a wide spectrum of outcomes that is patient-centered. So other terms that may have been used includes practical, naturalistic, and this reflects the need for evidence that we want to build that is applicable in a routine clinical setting, and that the evidence can be used to change practice, to change paradigm. And so pragmatic studies are more consistent with the practice and philosophy of therapies, practices like naturopathic medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine. And it takes into account that it's less focus on the disease itself and more focus on the patient. So we want to move from what's known as a reductionistic approach to studying health and care, and take into the totality of care that we tend to use from a naturopathic perspective, from a traditional medicine perspective. So we also want to look at interactions between the patient and the practitioner and the whole system of practice. So if we can move on with a scenario, in this case to start out, if we have a case of like this individual, call her Mary, who's a 35-year-old female, she may come into the clinic with a chief complaint of insomnia, but chances are that is not the only concern she has. She may have other symptoms like heartburn, leg cramps, anxiety, constipation. So there is a multiple layers of symptoms that is present. And typically in a naturopathic practice or with other traditional medical practices, the treatment plan is not a prescription for one particular drug. There's again, the protocol involves multiple layers, multifaceted treatment plan. So in this case, as an example, we're talking hypothetical here, we may use acupuncture, we may prescribe melatonin to help with her insomnia, we may prescribe meditation, some relaxation techniques, and dietary modification. And so you probably can appreciate from this that it's difficult to reduce the complexity of the case to a single symptom or complaint, and then trying to figure out what the intervention needs to be from a single variable, right? Because the plan incorporates multitude of modalities. And so how do we address that? Where we want to view health in a holistic fashion, looking at the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, that involves the whole person. So we're not simply looking at a single diseased part. And when we're looking at disease, it's not the presence or absence of a pathogen per se. Nowadays, we are more dealing with complex chronic conditions. And so looking at a single symptomology or symptom no longer works in how we need to treat our patients. And the treatments themselves need to be individualized. That's part of naturopathic care and other forms of traditional medical care as well. So how do we account for that? And so that is the question in terms of how do we study complex cases and also multifaceted treatments. How do we shift from a reductionistic model to a model that considers the totality of care? And so the research is the process in which we use to build our knowledge, as well as to share the knowledge through dissemination, through translation, with the goal ultimately to shift whether it's a paradigm, a change in our worldview, or to change practice, to change a system of practice, such as in healthcare. And so we can actually try to do that from a clinical setting as individual practitioners. So I will be talking about the three different methods in doing the research itself from a clinical setting. And this involves case studies, single subject design, and N-of-1 clinical trials. Now these methods are scientific inquiries that can be applied to the individual or to a small group of individuals. All these three approaches are actually relatively easy to integrate into clinical practice. And some of the measures that I'm going to talk about later may be useful, even if it's not for research, for you as clinicians who want to evaluate their own practice, how they're doing, what they're doing, and the services that you are providing through your practice. You may be able to do that without having to turn it into research per se. And the idea is to document individualized outcomes and to build evidence for the interventions that you use in clinical practice, and to collect or document how the connection between your intervention, your treatment, and the outcomes for your patient. So the case study. This is a type of descriptive research, and it is considered non-experimental. So the idea is to identify patterns in what's observed in terms of what the patient presents, what the treatment is and what the outcomes are. And this helps to actually generate hypotheses for future research. Now, with the case study, sometimes it's been used interchangeably with case report. And to me, a case study requires pre-planting. So it's pre-planned observation of your patient, of an individual, or it could be a group of patients. And it is to have to systematically document the process of clinical care. So there may be quantitative and qualitative data that is collected through observation, interview, and other forms of assessment. And the idea is to explore and also predict the response to a treatment or observe the natural history of a disease. So typically the methods to doing this is to record observations and provide narrative descriptions of the patient's characteristics and how they respond to treatment. The documentation provides a basis to infer the relationship between the observed characteristics, the symptoms that may be there, the details of the treatment, and then what the outcomes are. So a well-documented case study can provide a rationale to the use of specific interventions, whether it's a unique application or a systematic way of treating a certain condition or set of symptoms. Now, with the case study, the idea is not to test a hypothesis, but to generate a hypothesis. Because with this type of design, we are unable to demonstrate a causal relationship. We are not able to say, yes, the treatment is effective or causes the outcome of interest. This is because mainly we do not have control comparisons. It's a single case. We are providing or obtaining detailed observation and collecting that information. And so the observations cannot be generalized to other individuals or other cases in this regard. The next design we'll talk about is the single subject study design. And the single subject design is considered a quasi-experimental approach. And the idea is to investigate a possible causal relationship between what we call the independent variable, which would be the intervention or the treatment, and the dependent variable, which is our outcome. So it's a quasi-design because we're not controlling specific variables per se. We establish a set of baseline measures to see what the patient may be, what the symptoms are, and then using repeated measures to have that baseline, and then provide the intervention, and then again collect the data using repeated measures again for our outcome or dependable variable to see what the relationship, or if there is a relationship between those variables. So with this design, we would use systematic collection based on observation, measurements, grafting, and analysis of our outcome behavior. Because we use repeated measures, this is sometimes called a time series design, and I will show a graphic to illustrate that. So the data can be plotted on a graph and be analyzed for any change by whether it's by level, by trend, by variability between the baseline when no treatments are given and the intervention phase. So it may look something like this. This is a graphic display of how a single subject design may look like. These 3 different scenarios. So you can see here with what we call an ABA design. During phase A, no treatment is given. So this is the measure, the target behavior we are measuring over a series of days. And so let's say this may be energy. So without treatment, this individual's energy is low. When we do provide the treatment, the energy increases. So you can see the change in this measure. And then what happens when we remove the intervention or the treatment, the energy will go down again. So you can see a very distinct relationship between the intervention, the treatment, and the outcome or targeted behavior or outcome measure or dependent variable, depending on, those are all pretty synonymous. So this is one scenario as to how that can be visualized. This is another scenario in comparison where, again, no treatment. And then when you compare to no treatment with treatment, the dotted lines here show treatment. And so you can see a distinct difference between the no treatment and the treatment over this time period. So you can do it for a single individual, you can do it for more than one individual at a time. And then example 3 here, same idea. Here you are observing 3 different individuals and their measures. So at baseline, for these 3 different individuals, they're measured for different length of time. And then during the intervention phase, you can see how the behavior or the outcome measure changes in response to the treatment. So the graph data has the advantage of showing us visually how the individual responds. And so depending on what it is, it could be, for example C here, if we're talking about mobility, there may be low mobility before treatment, and mobility goes up and is sustained during treatment. So the different ways we can utilize the single subject design is the simplest is A-B, no treatment, treatment. If we want to increase validity of this, we can do A-B-A, where we remove the treatment and the behavior goes back to baseline, to what it was before. We can also do A-B-A-B, which is do another treatment phase and expect the behavior to, or the outcome measure to go back to what it was at the B phase. Or alternatively, we can actually do an A, B, A, C option, where C is a different treatment than B. And so that way allows us to compare the effectiveness of treatment B versus treatment C, which don't have a graph here to show that. The downside with this design is that it is not suitable if the outcome is not suitable to withdraw. So if we were to withdraw, this stays high, then we're not sure if it's the improvement in symptom is due to time itself, or if it's due to the intervention. And because the symptom is not reversible, then this design would not be appropriate to use to study the phenomenon. The third design is the N-of-1 randomized trial. And this is what we call a experimental design, because we will be controlling the variable or the treatment of interest. In this case, it actually utilizes the process of a randomized controlled trial. So the intervention can be compared to a placebo, or we can actually compare two different treatments. And the main part, the randomized component, means that there is a predeterminant to whether it's the intervention that is being given or the placebo that is being given. The randomization will be generated by a third party, so neither the clinician or the patient will know what the patient is actually getting. So we need to make sure that the intervention is able to be incorporated with a placebo. So for certain therapies, so I'm thinking perhaps meditation, where placebo may not be able to be used, then the N-of-1 design would not be useful. And in this case, the patient or subject would serve as their own control. So the analysis will compare what the patient, how the patient responds to getting the intervention, and how they respond when they are receiving the placebo. And the measures generally would require the patient to do a daily or weekly diary to record their symptoms, and so that there's measures for comparison. The other thing worth to note is that the outcome, the symptom, needs to be clinically relevant, and it can be measured. So we want symptoms that are measurable, that can be observed. And so we can see here from this graph what this would look like. Here, there's 3 phases to this study, and it's randomized, so we would not know, the clinician and the patient would not know what they would get first. So in this scenario, they started with placebo, and their scores were high. So this may be, if we're looking at, say, pain, this would be high degrees of pain. Because they're receiving the placebo, there's no change. When they get the active treatment, then the pain measure goes down. And then in the next phase, they may receive in this case, they're receiving the placebo. And we would not know that as a clinician or as the patient at this point until it's been unblinded. But you can see that the measure would go back up to what they would have if they had not received the intervention. And again, you see the change to that symptom once the active intervention is used again. And then in phase 3, starts with the active intervention, the symptom stays low, and when it's switched over to placebo, the symptoms go up again. And so this, you can see here, shows consistency of the measure for the outcome between placebo and active. The one, I guess, thing to note is that the response in this case needs to be quite quick acting. So you will not want to study intervention where it may take a week, a month for the symptom to respond, right? Because that makes it really hard to make the association between what the patient is taking and what their symptom response is like. And also you would want to pick a symptom that is reversible, meaning that the difference between getting the placebo and getting the active, the symptom will reappear when we're under placebo, and it will be reduced when it's under active. So that is important. So if it's a outcomes measure or a symptom that is constant across, then this would not be a useful design to do. And as you can see here, the results can be plotted. And the other advantage of the N-of-1 design is that we can conduct data analysis that depending on how many data points we have, which the other two previous design we would not be able to do. The N-of-1 design does require additional time. You can see it requires a longer phase to observe the back and forth between placebo and intervention. And it also takes quite a bit more commitment for the clinician and for the patient to collect the data. But with among the three designs I'm talking about, this one does provide the most objective data to help assess the outcome of the treatment, whether it's beneficial or useful or not. So before we do an N-of-1 RCT, a trial, there are some key questions that you want to ask before going ahead with it. And these are, is the N-of-1 trial indicated for the patient? That is the effectiveness of the treatment even testable? Some treatments may be, some may not be. Will the patient cooperate? That is very important because, as I said, it does require a bit of commitment, time, energy-wise from the patient as well as the clinician. So if the patient is not willing to do the weekly or daily diary and not able to commit the time, then this may not be an appropriate approach. Is it feasible to do this? So again, does the treatment have a rapid onset? Will we see a change to the symptom with treatment? And also, once the treatment is discontinued, will the symptoms return? Is there a length of time that's optimal for the treatment? So is the time between treatment and response, is it a long period or is it a short period of time? And do we know the criteria for stopping the trial? That is important to know. The third question is it feasible to do it in a clinical setting? So within your practice, let's say if you have to randomize, is there a pharmacist or a colleague, an office manager, somebody who can actually do the randomization and maintain the blind? The other component to consider is, can the data be interpreted? So what kind of data are you collecting? Does it make sense? And lastly, and I think this is the most important part, is the study ethical? Is it ethical to do this? Is it ethical to have your patient go through a period of time when they will be receiving placebo? And sometimes it may not be, and if that's the case, then this is not an appropriate design to use. So those are the three main designs that may be useful in a clinical setting to do short-term study for a single patient subject or a small group. So you can do a series of patients if it's consistent. Now I am going to move on to two concepts that I believe are important for studying practices such as naturopathic medicine or traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine that utilizes a spectrum of modalities and therapies. So given the complexity of treatment plans, something like the N-of-1 trial may not seem applicable. So the question is, how do we study the multifaceted nature that uses multiple modalities to treat the whole person? So it's not about just reducing a symptom and even really having a one type of treatment across the board for everybody, right? Because we want to utilize individualized treatment. So how do we study a whole system of care that is patient-centered? And this is the idea for this whole systems research. This is a coin that was, this was a term that was coined in 2002 by a group of researchers, clinicians, academics who recognized the need for study approach that takes into consideration the approach, the systems approach in traditional medicines like Chinese medicine, naturopathy, where the treatment modalities may be complex, that is using more than one type of treatment at a time, so it's not reduced to a single variable. And also take into consideration not just the practice, but the philosophy behind the practice. So to look at the patient-practitioner interaction, any techniques that are used to change patient behavior, the healing approaches that follows different unique philosophy. And so the intention was to incorporate various aspects to treatment that follows the philosophical basis, the uniqueness of the practitioner-patient interaction, the materials that are used, as well as considering the experience of the patient. So the researcher, the clinician may have one way of viewing what the patient's needs are, but that doesn't necessarily follow or consistent with what the patients are looking to obtain. And so this whole systems research concept also fits well with the other concept I'm going to talk about, which is a patient-oriented research. And so if we're to consider a practice like naturopathic medicine, we know that the treatments that are prescribed are often concurrent in different forms, different modalities, and even different levels according to be consistent with the needs of the patient. And so those treatments are individualized. Two patients may come to the clinic complaining of arthritis, and chances are those two patients will not be receiving the exact same treatment when they leave that clinic, right? And so how do we take that into consideration when we want to study whether the intervention, which is a number of modalities taking into consideration, whether that has an effect on the patient's wellness. And so that's the premise that underscores this concept of whole systems research. So this concept acknowledges there's unique characteristics as well as perspectives of the patient and their clinical experience, as well as taking into consideration the other external factors. And so the outcomes that needs to be measured needs to be more than just a single outcome. So more than just sleep, pain, energy, but taking into considerations objective measures. So there could be lab tests, it may be a measurement of pain, but we can also assess patients' preferences or patient-reported outcomes, which may be more subjective. So this could be quality of life, it could be functionality, it could be fatigue, it could be social functioning, it could be vitality. So there's different layers to the outcome measures that we can collect. So ideally, this would, may appreciate, require a large clinical trial to test this whole system. And we would need to collect both qualitative and quantitative in order to do that. However, I think the whole systems research concept does apply well to the designs that I've just talked about, the single subject, the case study, and even the N-of-1 RCT, because it can take all these different areas with the multifaceted intervention as well as the complex outcome into consideration when we're collecting the data. So there are a number of pros and cons associated with whole systems research. The pros are that we're looking at more than just a single variable, which tends to be the case when we talk about research from a biomedical model. So with the whole systems, it's in keeping with the more holistic approach to the practice of traditional forms of medicine, and can include a wide range of metrics from the qualitative to the quantitative, looking at patient experience as well as their perspectives. And it fits well with the pragmatic approach to look at the real world setting and the real world expectations for both the clinician and the patient. And so with this approach, it's what's considered to be more patient-centered, which I'll talk a bit about more in a bit. And actually it would provide more external validity, meaning that the outcomes can be generalized to a broad audience. The downside to this is a downside, more of a limitation, I would say, is that it can be quite expensive to have a full study, which requires a lot more resources, budget. The data analysis, the statistical analysis can be fairly complex. And so the interpretation, again, can be complex and maybe multi-layered. And so the challenge is what can we use to compare whether a whole system of a practice is working or not. So you can appreciate the complexity in that. So for example, for the N-of-1 design that I described, the comparator may very well be the patient, him or herself, where if the intervention is removed, and so if the care was not received, then their symptoms may return. And so in that sense, that would be a useful comparator if it can be done. So whole systems research lends well to patient-oriented research. And this term refers to the continuum of research from the initiation of studies in developing the research question to comparing the effectiveness of intervention and outcome that can inform care, whether it's in the healthcare system or in clinical practice. And patient-oriented research comes from the idea of patient-centered care, where the experience, the perspectives of patients have a primary voice in the establishment and setting up the research protocol. So it's focusing on the patient within the system rather than at a population level. And so patient-oriented research actually is well suited for clinical research, whether it's to change clinical practice or to change or improve healthcare as a system. So this does require a higher level of engagement from patients in all aspects of the research process. So patients may be involved in helping to develop the research question. They may help with the recruitment, data collection, to interpretation of the results, or to even help with disseminating the findings of the study. And so the ways to incorporate or involve patient voice are the use of measures called patient-reported outcomes measures, which is shortened to PROMs, and or patient-reported experience measures, which is shortened to PREMs. And I talked about, and it looks something like this. The PROMs can be used to measure the impact of an illness or a health condition, and this would be from the patient's perspective. So an example of these are can be standardized questionnaires that measure the quality of life. So like examples of that would be the EQ5D is one. Or you can measure symptom severity, such as pain, fatigue. Can also look at things like distress, mental health status, so degree of depression, anxiety, and maybe looking at functionality or self-reported health status. So using SF12 or SF36 to gauge what the level, the status of the patient's illness or condition is. And this will help to monitor the progress of the patient's health to see if the patient is responding to treatment or not, and how they are over time. So these measures don't necessarily have to be for research purposes. It can actually be useful for clinicians to monitor how their patients are doing. So those are the outcome measures. The PRAMs, the experience measures, looks at the patient's view of what is happening during their health care. So whether it's a visit or the process of care. And examples of types of information or data that's collected in using the PRAMs. Things like time spent waiting. So if you have a busy clinic that has long waiting times, that this may be something that's important for patients, and it might be important to help improve service delivery. And so it's one measure that may be collected. Looking at the involvement of patients in the decision-making in terms of their care, whether patients feel they are able to give input into their care plan, looking at their knowledge of their care plan, the quality of the communication between, say, practitioner and patient, with staff. That may be important to help change practice or change services within a clinic. So you can see that the patient experience can help inform to improve service delivery and care in general for the patients. So the most important part for this is that these measures come from the patient's perspective. We can use questionnaires, you can use interviews, you can use open-ended question surveys to obtain these measures. And so with the goal of assessing the quality of care and service, and hopefully to improve the patient's experience within the clinic. So I'll just skip this quickly. It's just to how to translate our clinical impressions to a research question using these strategies. And so again, as a synopsis, how we translate or how we use our clinical impression to formulate a research question for study. It's a matter of translating our observation, our symptom report, observation, assessment, and plan to formulate a research question and seeing which of these approaches, whether it's a case study, single subject design, or N-of-1 clinical trial, is the most appropriate in answering the research question. So since we only have 10 minutes left, I think I will skip the example I was going to use of the study that I did with a colleague of mine, Dr. Wendy Takeda, on the use of acupuncture treatments in kids with anxiety. It's actually published in the pediatrics journal, so you're welcome to read about the study in that. And I will see what questions there are up to this point.
Hi, Brenda. There's just the one question so far. It was just one person wrote in on the chat and said they're a bit confused by the randomization part. So it was just after you'd finished speaking about the office manager and them controlling the randomization. They kind of put that in there that they didn't quite understand, I believe.
Oh, okay. So for the N-of-1 design, the important component is the randomization. So typically when we talk about RCT, a randomized control trial, we typically have two groups, a placebo group and the treatment group. And so the randomization that's generated is like flipping of a coin. The person could be in the placebo group, or they can be in the active intervention group. And so there's no way of knowing which group the patient will be in. In the N-of-1 study, because we only have one person, we don't have a group of people going into the two arms, then the randomization that's generated is whether that person will start with a placebo and then get the intervention, or they will get the intervention first and then the placebo. And then for each of those phases that I had on the chart, they may get placebo, intervention, intervention, placebo, placebo, intervention. So those are totally random. It's not preset in any way. And so neither the clinician or the patient will know if they're taking the placebo or the active intervention during those phases. Just want to show you, anyone who's interested in this study that I was going to use to illustrate the points I have previously made, but because I talked for too long, I didn't get a chance to do that. It's in the Journal of Pediatrics and Child Health, February 2018 issue, and this is the DOI number if anyone wants to look it up. If there's other questions.
Someone did just write in, and they were asking, they're interested in doing research in autism. Can they use patient-oriented research? Now, I would guess that there's a lot of dependence on that and where they're from and the age and restrictions, but please let us know.
Yeah, so the two concepts I talked about, the whole systems research and the patient-oriented research, I could probably spend an hour talking on each of those topics alone. The idea with the patient-oriented research is the inclusion of patients into the research process. So yes, you can, with the idea of bringing patients onto the research team so that you can get the insights from the patient in terms of what are the important questions, concerns from their perspective. So to develop a research protocol, even asking the research question, the idea with the patient-oriented research is that the patient's views, their voice is heard throughout the research process. So as a clinician, you may have a particular view or thought about what the research question is and what kind of research needs to be done. And then when you talk to a patient or talk to a family of a patient with autism, their concerns, their views may be very different. And so it's about approaching research, doing the study, collecting data, using outcome measures that are relevant to the patient to obtain findings or results that are important from the patient's perspective.
Okay, great. We did get another question, and it was, I believe it's on the study that we have in front of us in the anxiety. And they were just curious as to the challenges faced during that specific study.
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, as with any studies, there's several challenges. I think one of the main challenges in this case were because we were recruiting children with anxiety. A lot of times, the people that contacted us about the study were the parents because they wanted their children enrolled in the study. But the children themselves, when you hear about acupuncture, the idea of needles obviously were difficult for many children to buy in. So that one of the challenges was to explain to children the nature of the intervention about the study. So unfortunately, I'm sorry I didn't have time to go through it, but how we did it was we had the option of needles, but we also offer cupping as well as the herbal seeds as part of the intervention for the children, and they were individualized. So some children were able to do the needles, and others who were apprehensive, we use cupping or we use the herbal seeds for them until they were comfortable or were open for us to use the needles, and then we were able to use the needles with them. You know, today's presentation, I think intention is to provide to give a introduction to the possible designs that we can use as clinicians within our clinical setting. And like I said, each of those concepts and designs, I can most likely spend like an hour on each of them alone. So hopefully this gives you an idea going forward of how you may be able to incorporate some research into your work, whether it's practice or in research, and the idea of incorporating the whole systems, so not that we don't need to reduce our therapies to a single variables. There are other options out there, and the importance of incorporating the patient view into the research as well. Otherwise, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Brenda. I think there's a big shout out from all of us over here and all over the world where everyone's joining us from. We appreciate your time and everything you did to prepare for the lecture. All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Brenda, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight.